And there's yet another factor. Some of you may have followed the recent controversy surrounding a forthcoming book from Yale University Press about the Danish cartoons, a book in which it was announced that the cartoons themselves, absurdly, would not appear. The head of Yale University Press said he feared retribution. Others have pointed to evidence strongly suggesting that the decision not to include the cartoons in the book came from the very highest levels at that university and had something to do with the Yale administration's concern about offending Saudi Arabian princes with deep pockets. The powerful impact of Saudi money in the West has already made itself clear. Countless mosques and madrasas in Europe would not exist if not for Saudi money. The Washington Post's resident authority on Islam, John Esposito, is the director of an Institute on Islam at Georgetown University that was funded entirely by the Saudi prince for which it is named and who himself handpicked Esposito to run it. It is one of the most grotesque aspects of the present conflict that even as George W. Bush sent soldiers to put their lives on the line to fight armed jihad, he continued to be extremely friendly with Saudi leaders who fund schools and mosques and institutions in the West that teach and preach jihad and that give it not only material but moral support. So far, those who have taken an open stand against the Islamization of the West have been people identified more or less with the right. For doing so, they've been criticized intensely by many on the left. This is madness. It only shows how far many people on the left have migrated philosophically from being true liberals. They don't seem to know what liberal values are anymore, and they don't recognize an absurdly obvious threat to liberal values when it's staring them right in the face. To put it simply, this is and should be a liberal battle. A battle for free speech, for freedom of religion, for the equality of the sexes, and the rights of people to live their lives as they see fit. As Lincoln famously said, a country cannot remain half slave and half free. Permit tyranny in your midst, and you will end up tyrannized yourself. In the wake of the terrorist attacks in London and Madrid, in the wake of the Van Gogh murder and the cartoon riots, and the months of nightly disturbances complete with cries of Allahu Akbar in the French suburbs, it's clear that the West's freedom now comes with an asterisk. In Western Europe, it's clear that many leaders have already chosen a gradual and amiable accommodation with extreme illiberality over an unpleasantly confrontational defense of liberty. Apparently, in the view of all too many of these leaders, the only hope for peaceful coexistence with the Muslims in their midst lies in an ever more vigorously exhorted and enforced deference to and accommodation of Islam. Increasingly, non-Muslim women are enjoined to respect an ideology that views them as whores who are in profound need of merciless discipline. Gays are enjoined to respect an ideology that would condemn them to death. Free people are enjoined to respect an ideology that in larger and smaller ways is already stripping them of their freedom. When I first moved to Europe, the challenge to freedom was still relatively invisible. As I've said, you had to veer away from the tourist centers to begin to get the real picture. No more. On a couple of nights last January, only 10 minutes walk from my front door, there were violent riots on the main street of Oslo, a street that is generally quiet and orderly, if not downright dull. But on those January nights, Oslo looked like Gaza at its worst. In fact, the rioters' motive was supposedly rage over events in Gaza. In reality, the riots were nothing more than a brutal show of force by young men who probably could not find Gaza on a map, but who were plainly determined to bend Norway to their will. As such, it was no isolated incident, but yet another step in a relentless process that I began witnessing 11 years ago in Amsterdam. And of course, this isn't a European phenomenon. Events like the prosecution of Ezra Levant and Mark Stein made it clear to me that the one major mistake that I did make in my book, While Europe Slept, was in underestimating the vulnerability of North America to the same forces that I saw bringing down freedom in Western Europe. 9/11, 7/7 in London, 4/11 in Madrid. After each of these and other atrocities, European officials and journalists wasted no time reminding everybody that only a tiny minority of Western Muslims are terrorists. And of course, that's true. But it is not the point. Jihadist terrorism is only a distraction from the subtler forms of jihad going on all around us. Indeed, terrorism, as many jihadists have realized, is counterproductive because it only underscores the fact that there is indeed a jihad underway, and it draws media attention and it causes a public reaction. But what the media can, and to an extraordinary extent do, avoid covering, and what the public can therefore fail to fully notice and comprehend, are the subtler, less spectacular everyday aspects of jihad and of the capitulation thereto. And these developments are far more dangerous than terrorism, for terrorism cannot destroy the freedom of the West. What can destroy it is a gradual, broad-based, officially unacknowledged, and almost imperceptible day-by-day adjustment to Islam and to Sharia law. An adjustment that, if allowed to continue, will indeed ultimately lead to the end of freedom as we know it. This is the silent jihad and the silent surrender, and we're living right in the midst of it. And the unfortunate reality is that we can't sit back and relax in the assurance that our mainstream media will keep us fully informed about the ongoing threats to our freedom, and that our governments will protect us from those threats. They won't. If we cherish our freedom, we have to keep our eyes open and our ears open, and not be afraid to speak honestly, openly, and boldly to our friends as well as to our political leaders about what we see and hear and how we feel about it. Thank you.
If you have any questions, or I would invite you to come to the microphone. Si vous avez des questions, je vous invite à venir vers le microphone. Oui, absolument.
Yeah, I'd also like to ask Mark to stay up here, and I'd like to ask Fred to come up, because I think that they have a much better perspective on the Canadian angle to these issues than I do.
Alors, s'il vous plaît, si c'est possible, d'être le plus succinct possible, d'aller directement à la question. Et if you can possibly just be as succinct as possible, go directly to the question, and maybe ask the proper question, whatever. Just go ahead. Sorry.
Can I ask 2 questions?
We'll start with the first one.
Mr. Bawer, which countries, according to your opinion, are faring better at realizing the potential threat that's here?
Which countries are
faring better at realizing the menace that is present?
I think the one country, listen to this. Now, I'm gone. This is great. I think the one country in Western Europe, now it's too loud, isn't it? The one country in Western Europe that really is starting to, at the very least, starting to get its act together on these issues is Denmark. Now, after there was several years ago, there was a survey in Denmark that was a study, rather, that was done in Denmark showing that I think it was by the year 2050, if I'm not mistaken, that the Muslim population of Denmark, if present trends continued, would be extremely high. I don't remember exactly what the figure was, but it was a high enough figure to strike terror into the minds of a lot of people in that country. And in the next election, the Socialist Party, which had been in charge of that country for a very, very long time, was voted out. The new prime minister was a man named Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who very courageously began to introduce certain reforms in immigration and certain more stringent requirements that would lead to integration. And as a reward for this, he was vilified throughout Western Europe by politicians and by his political opponents in his country, and of course by the media in his own country for the most part. But he has introduced, for example, something called the 24-year law, which addresses the fact that most of the Muslim immigration to Europe comes through marriage. A Muslim in Europe marries a Muslim back in the country of origin. This accounts for a very, very high percentage of marriages by Muslims in Europe. In some cases, 80, 90 or more percent. And in the great majority of these cases, these people are marrying their first cousins. And the whole purpose of the marriage, these are forced marriages, and the purpose is to bring more and more members of the family to Europe so that they can enjoy the economic benefits of it, and so forth. And the purpose of this law was to try to stem that. And the idea was they were marrying off girls and boys who were 16, 17 years old, in some cases younger. And the law says both parties to one of these marriages have to be 24 years old if they want to live in Denmark together. This has really made a major difference. The idea being that by the time a young person is 24 years old, perhaps they've gotten an education, perhaps they've developed some sense of independence, perhaps they've got more of a sense of their rights than they did when they were 15 or 16, and they're more in a position to stand up to their parents and say, I'm not going to marry this person. Maybe they will already have fallen in love with somebody and will be able to work something out. This has worked. This has worked to a very good extent. Denmark has also simply shifted its arrangements in the places it takes in immigrants from. It's not taking in fewer immigrants, it's taking them from different places. And this is making quite a difference. It's perhaps not as strong a set of measures as it could be, but it's far better than what any other country in Western Europe is doing.
Interesting. My second question is out of curiosity. Have you been briefed or are you informed of what has transpired here? We've had a debate in recent years about what we call reasonable accommodations. Have you been, do you have some knowledge of that? Have you been briefed on that?
I've been in Canada for a few days now, and my head has been about to explode about 50 times. I have learned things that I really had no idea about. I mean, I've concentrated on Western Europe and to some extent on the United States, and I really had no idea of the extent to which things here were going to hell in a handbasket. And if somebody else doesn't write about it, I'm going to.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Some conservative heads of state in Europe, like Nicolas Sarkozy and Angela Merkel, who generally have taken a relatively hard line on Islamism, seem to be pandering to their respective Muslim communities when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's an inordinate amount of pressure now on Israel to curb settlement activity, and yet